Welcome to Staying Connected, a podcast where I talk to people about their stories with VEDS, Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, and related vascular and aortic connective tissue conditions. The views, information, and opinions in this podcast are those of the individuals involved, and the information presented does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk to Tammy Asplund about her story with Loeys-Dietz syndrome, which she was diagnosed with when she was 52 after her son found out that he had an aneurysm and also needed open heart surgery. Once he was diagnosed, it explained their family history, and Tammy got tested and had open heart surgery as well. Before we jump into the interview, if you like this podcast and you want to support our community in our efforts to raise awareness through this show, you can buy merch in my Printify pop-up store, make a one-time donation, or support the show by joining my Patreon. This show wouldn't be possible without the continued support of my Patreon subscribers and donors, so if you've already been supporting the show, thank you. Check out the episode show notes for links to ways to support the show. Let's get into the interview with Tammy. Hey, Tammy, thank you so much for joining the podcast to share your story with Loeys-Dietz syndrome. Do you want to introduce yourself to people who don't know you yet?
Sure. My name is Tammy Asplund. I am 57 years old, and I live in South Carolina. I have Loeys-Dietz type 1.
And when did you get diagnosed with Loeys-Dietz type 1?
I was diagnosed in 2020. It started actually with my son. He was diagnosed first. He called me one day saying, "Mom, I'm headed to the emergency room. I've got this terrible headache. I'm sure it's an aneurysm." And I said, It's not. Just go and have them check it out and you'll be fine. Call me when they're done. And he called a couple hours later and he said, "Well, actually, it's an aneurysm. I'm going to the operating room and they're going to place a stent in." And so because of some family history and other things, they did a full genetic panel and discovered that he had Loeys-Dietz type 1. And then, of course, they wanted me to be tested as well since it's genetic.
What made him think of an aneurysm?
He actually already had been diagnosed with an aneurysm in his aortic root when he was 5 years old, and so we had been monitoring that for many, many years. So I think that when the headache pain started, that was just what he went to.
Yeah, that makes sense. So he calls you, and then he ends up in surgery, and he ends up diagnosed with Loeys-Dietz syndrome. So then, did you automatically say, "Oh, I need to go to the geneticist," or how did that?
Yeah, it was pretty, our family history, actually, my father died when I was 3. He was 32 years old, and he died after his second open heart surgery. And so, of course, this was 1970, and Loeys-Dietz hadn't even actually been identified at that time, but we're quite certain after talking to the geneticist that he probably had Loeys-Dietz as well. So given the family history, yeah, it was kind of a foregone conclusion as soon as my son was diagnosed that I got in to see a geneticist and was diagnosed myself.
How did that feel for you?
It wasn't as scary being diagnosed myself as hearing my son say that he had been diagnosed. And in some ways, it was sort of a relief because there had been so many medical issues throughout my lifetime that were unexplained. A lot of, I got the feeling from a lot of doctors, they thought things were in my head. So I felt a little validated, actually, when I got the diagnosis, because I felt like finally there was an answer to all of those things that had been going on.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about some of those things?
Sure. I was always very thin and very flexible and kind of wiry, and so I always had a lot of trouble with my joints. I had terrible, terrible problems with my menstrual cycles from the time they started. Endometriosis. I had a very early hysterectomy. I was only 36 years old when I had a full hysterectomy. There were a lot of unexplained things. I always bruised so easily. I I would, everywhere I would have these bruises, and people would say, well, how did you do that? I don't know. I just have them, and so that was always part of my life, migraines, all kinds of things. So.
Yeah. Are you hypermobile at all too?
I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you get this diagnosis and you're like, I'm just putting myself in your shoes because I think that I had kind of a similar feeling when I was diagnosed with VEDS, this having been ignored or disregarded or made to feel kind of like it was in my head. And I don't know how much of that is I think women experience that more. I think that's probably validated in the research, but very, very relatable. So did you get a full body scan at that point? Did you find more things, less things?
I did. Actually, once my son had the stent placed, they determined that he needed to have the valve-sparing aortic replacement done right away because the size of his aorta was still well past what it should have been, for somebody with Loeys-Dietz. So he was scheduled for his surgery in March of 2020, and we went there to be there for his surgery, and actually stayed for a couple of weeks to help him out afterward, and got on the plane just as things were starting to close down because of COVID, actually. And so in that time between when he had the brain aneurysm and his surgery, I had gone to the geneticist and I got my diagnosis. And so just shortly before his surgery, I saw a cardiologist here, and they said, oh yeah, you're also way over the size you need to be. You need to have open heart surgery. So a couple months later, I had mine. So it was a very strange few months that we had here in our family because there was just, all of these things going on.
Yeah, that sounds so overwhelming, especially in the beginning of a pandemic.
Yeah.
On top of that.
Yeah. I had my surgery. I had to drive to Birmingham, Alabama, because there actually wasn't a doctor close here that wanted to do my surgery. So I drove, and yes, there were miles of car lines for the COVID testing to even get to the hospital. And then my husband, of course, only was allowed to come in for an hour a day while I was there because of, the COVID regulations. So it was a little surreal.
Yeah. How did the surgery go?
It went actually really, really well. I was very grateful. The hospital was great. The staff was great. All the medical people that I came into contact with, I had a pretty easy time of it. The only thing I was not expecting after the surgery, I had a little problem with AFib, but they were able to fix it up with some medications, and that was fine. But yeah, I went home after, I think I was there for 5 days, and then I went home, and my recovery was actually pretty well. I went back to work in 5 weeks, so it was good.
That sounds super fast. It sounds like I know that the surgeries are open and they involve opening up your sternum.
Yep.
And that just seems super wild to think that you went in and then 5 days later you're home recovering.
You could go home. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a little weird, but I think that my husband was very adamant about making sure that I followed all of the instructions to a T. I mean, he had his notes and he was, make sure you do this and this and this and this. I did a lot of walking, which was, the doctor said, make sure you get up and walk around and keep your, blood pumping and your lungs flowing. And yeah, it went really well. I felt very fortunate.
Yeah. I have notes here. I just want to make sure that we don't miss it.
Mm-hmm.
So you had this year of stuff, right? I mean, I wrote down severe nosebleeds before heart surgery.
Yeah.
So do you want to jump into that a little?
Sure. So my recovery after the open heart surgery, they want you to go to a physical therapy for cardiology, and it's, they put you on the machine and they monitor and take your blood pressure and all these things. And it was I want to say it was like for 6 weeks. I was supposed to go a couple of times a week, but about 2 weeks into it, I had been having nosebleeds prior to the open heart surgery. And so the doctor said, well, after you get past this, we'll go in and we'll take care of the nosebleeds for you. So I did. So I scheduled the surgery. He was going to fix my deviated septum. He was going to fix, cauterize and take care of the nosebleeds, and it was all going to be great. And then, I got out of the hospital. It was like a 1-day thing, and thought it was fine. And a day later, nosebleeds started like something I have never experienced. And this went on off and on for weeks, where I would go into the hospital and I would go to the operating room and they would try something and they would send me home. And then like 2 days later, it would happen again. And so it was 4 hospital stays, 5 trips to the operating room, and 2 blood transfusions before they could stop the nosebleed. And so that was rather frightening. I think that was actually more frightening to me than the open heart surgery was.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. And then just a few weeks after the final nosebleed surgery, I actually got an infection in my bloodstream, and I was hospitalized for 9 days because I was in sepsis. And after that 9 days was done, they sent me home on a round-the-clock IV for 6 weeks that I had to be on antibiotics with a pump, and have a home nurse come. And
oh my goodness.
It was a few months of just complete, I can't even believe this is happening to me, because it was just so much stuff.
Yeah. So you had these nosebleeds, and then you had all these surgeries for the nosebleeds and blood transfusions for the nosebleeds.
Yep.
And then you had open heart surgery somewhere in the middle of that, or after?
The open heart surgery was the first thing.
Okay, so it's open heart
surgery, then all the nosebleeds, then the blood infection.
Oh, my gosh.
It was just, like I said, it was about a 6-month period of just lots of hospital stays and lots of medical things. I think I racked up about $250,000 worth of medical stuff.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, it was nuts.
Yeah. So that's all in the first year of your diagnosis with Loeys-Dietz syndrome.
Yes.
And then did they find additional aneurysms in other places too? Or
yes. When I had the full body scan to check everything out, I actually have 7 additional aneurysms that are being monitored, all in the abdomen. So. And
did none of those required surgery right away?
Not yet.
All right.
Knock on wood.
And it's been like 4.5 years, I guess going on 5 years since your diagnosis.
Yep. So it's good. I mean, they've been relatively stable. There's been, some growth in some of them, but nothing that they've, said, well, we've got to get in there and take care of it. So I'm thankful that it's been, rather stable at this time.
Yeah. That's a hell of a year that's just a lot. I mean, not only for yourself, but also your son having to go through open heart surgery as well and getting diagnosed. And how did you cope during that period of time? Whether it be around the open heart surgery or the aneurysms, I know there's probably some of our listeners who are also living with aneurysms in their abdomen and are pretty scared about that. How did that feel, and how did you cope with it?
Originally, it felt a little overwhelming because I just kept sort of focusing on this, these quote unquote failure points, if you will, possibly life-threatening events that could happen in all of these 7 places. But I think over time, as I talked to more people in this community, I joined some of the support groups through the Marfan org, and I've actually met other people with the syndrome and talked with other people with VEDS and with Marfan. And so that helped tremendously, just getting other people's perspective and experience. And I think also the fact that I work really hard to keep my body as strong as I can given the circumstances. I do a lot of regular exercise every day. I do stretching. I do a little resistance training. I do, swimming several times a week. We hike. I do as much as I possibly can to strengthen what I can so that I feel more prepared for when some of these catastrophic things may happen in the future. I have church, which gives me that center and family to support. So I think that, all of those things really rolled up help keep my peace of mind.
Yeah. You mentioned the physical activity that you're doing, which is awesome. Mm-hmm. What was your life like before this diagnosis?
My husband and I exercised a couple times a week. We would do this sort of walking/jogging routine, which was fine, but we weren't, we certainly weren't as adamant about keeping up with the schedule as we are now. Now it's a daily thing. It is really something that I am very regimented around. I don't like to miss any days, unless there's some really extenuating circumstance. But even walking, 10,000 steps a day is my minimum. I try to get between 15 and 16,000 steps a day. And that requires me setting actual timers on my phone that go off every 2 hours. And I have to remind myself, okay, get up and get away from your computer and go outside and walk for a few minutes, because I just think it's really important, not only for the physicality of it, also it helps the state of mind. I think when you're out walking, you can kind of just breathe deeply and relax and let your mind sort of settle and let go of some anxiety.
Yeah, for sure. Especially like nature walks and hikes and stuff too.
Yeah. Hikes are really, really good for that.
Yeah. So can you remind me how many children you have?
I have two. I have a boy and a girl. One I gave birth to, and one joined our family later.
Yeah, so let's talk about pregnancy. Mm-hmm. Because you were diagnosed like way after you were pregnant. I mean, I don't want to say way after, but
it was way after.
Years after.
No, I was pregnant at 27, and I actually had what I would consider to be an easy pregnancy. I had no morning sickness. I felt really good throughout the pregnancy. I had a natural childbirth. I didn't have an epidural. I didn't have any kinds of, other drugs, which looking back now is really not recommended for somebody with Loeys-Dietz. If I were pregnant now, of course, it would be considered a high-risk pregnancy, and they would watch me much more closely, but I was oblivious at the time. So I just carried on and did what the OBGYN told me to do. And, everything was fine. I had no issues with the pregnancy at all, which, I hope for people out there who are on the fence about, how a pregnancy can be for LDS people. It doesn't have to be, catastrophic. It doesn't have to be anything bad. It probably did not help the size of my aorta going through a natural childbirth, but we weren't monitoring it then, so I can't really say for sure.
Yeah. That's wonderful that it went smoothly and had no idea.
Yep.
Yeah, that's awesome. You mentioned the endometriosis, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's something, at least for VEDS, I think it's something that the people in the community who have it probably very strongly believe, including myself, that it's related to having VEDS. Do you feel similarly about that with Loeys-Dietz? Like, have you met a lot of people with endometriosis with Loeys-Dietz?
I have heard that from quite a few people with Loeys-Dietz, and I think I haven't read anything specifically that supports that, but I would be very surprised if it did not have anything to do with the connective tissue problems. I had the hysterectomy at such a young age because from the time my menstrual cycle started, I had really terribly heavy bleeding. I mean, the kind that would send me to the emergency room regularly. And so I suffered with that for many, many years. And it was, honestly, once I had the hysterectomy, it was the best thing. It completely changed my life. I mean, it was just such a relief not to deal with that all the time.
So when you had your hysterectomy at 36, did you go through menopause then at that time?
I did. And another weird thing, I had no symptoms. I was completely like nothing. No, not a single hot flash, no mood swings, no anything. Now, sadly, what happened was because I felt so good and there weren't any issues, I never went on hormone replacement therapy, which led me to have osteoporosis at a very young age. Yeah. So if I could go back and change that one thing, I probably would.
Yeah. That's good information for our listeners who might be going through that too. I really suspect that there's a high number of people in our community who deal with endometriosis and maybe want to consider a hysterectomy, but are scared of the surgery. And I know that for at least, for people with VEDS, like I have friends with VEDS who have said that like their best decision was getting a hysterectomy for that issue. But it's a super scary thing to consider when you know about the diagnosis of the connective tissue condition too. So pro tip, always check with your doctors. Don't get your medical advice from me or Tammy on this podcast.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important information for people, and it's an area that I think is understudied.
Yes.
Yeah. So you are 57 now, right? And you've known about Loeys-Dietz in your life for a few years, even though you've had kind of issues to monitor. It's such an interesting age, I think, to be diagnosed with this.
Yeah.
What has it been like connecting with other people in the community? Like, how did you start getting connected with people in the community? What was all of that like?
I think it started, I had some questions and I found the Marfan organization. And so I started looking around their website, and I had posed a couple of questions to their, they've got like a nurse who answers, just generic questions. And I was directed to some of their support groups. And then through somebody that I met in the support groups, I found a couple of the Facebook groups that are out there. There's a families one, and the foundation has one as well. And so that's how I started meeting people. And then when I went to the conference a few months ago, it was a virtual conference, so we were all chatting in the chat box, and we were saying where we were from. And I noticed there was a posting from a woman who was like 30 minutes from me. I'm like, no way. So I contacted her. I reached out, and we've actually been meeting now for lunches and things, and,
that's so
and catching
cool.
up. So yeah, it's actually just really nice to have somebody else in the community who's close by that we can get together and kind of just talk about things.
Yeah.
Very nice. Yeah.
So nice. And I'm glad you went to so you haven't been to an in-person conference yet.
Not yet, but I'm looking forward to it next year.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. It's I'm so excited for you to have that experience. It's like so magical. And I can't wait to meet you in person. That's going to be awesome. For sure.
Likewise.
So, along those same lines of being diagnosed kind of later in life, it seems like it almost changed. How do I say this? Like, there's people that I know, including myself, who got diagnosed in the 20s, in my 20s, and it reduced my physical activity level for a while because I was so scared, right?
Yep.
And I've known people in their 40s who get diagnosed, and it's like a huge hit to the mind about this diagnosis and what it means for your life. And, that fear factor kind of comes in too. It feels like it's maybe a little bit opposite for you in some ways. I mean, What does this feel like later in life to have this diagnosis?
Part of the benefit of getting older is that you have more experience to draw from. And so I think that when situations present themselves that are challenging, I feel like I just have more resources to draw from because I've been around longer and experienced more things. I think it's much more difficult for people who are younger. I know that certainly my son has had a harder time dealing with the diagnosis than I have. And again, part of it might be too from just all the years of medical things that, doctors sort of just went, well, rub some dirt in it, you're fine. So everything that comes up, I just tend to, be like, well, okay, it's this new thing and we'll figure it out and we'll roll along with it and whatever has to happen will. And I don't know. I think it's just age and experience.
Yeah. It sounds like a better place to be dealing with the diagnosis just from this place of, okay, I got this, Yeah.
Actually, I think when I was on my way to Birmingham to do the surgery, I took a selfie, my husband and I, in the car. It was like 5 o'clock in the morning because we had to drive 6 hours, to get where we were going. And so I took this selfie and I posted it on Facebook, and I was like, so I'm off to have open heart surgery. Someone hold my beer. Because,
Yeah.
It's all good.
Yeah. How has self-care been since your diagnosis?
I am learning to be better about self-care. Being part of the generation that I am from, care of your mental health was not something that was talked about when I was younger, and there was always a stigma. People who was, oh, she's in therapy, or oh, she's seeing a counselor, and so I struggled with that a lot at first, but I think that I'm getting better with it. I have actually recently sought the guidance of a professional therapist to work through some things, the anxiety for one, and yeah, I think I'm. It's a little bit of a struggle, but I'm working on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cannot recommend therapy enough for people out there listening. I see a therapist too. Yeah. I have this quote here that we talked about earlier. I think I wrote down something that you said when we were talking before. And I want to make sure that it gets in there if it's something that you want to talk about. It's actually two quotes. One is, you don't look like someone with Marfan or LDS, so it must not be too serious. And the other quote was, too many people have found out they have it after their children have passed. Do you want to talk about either of those things?
Sure. The you don't look like you have a connective tissue disorder, I have heard from medical professionals who I fired and replaced with other medical professionals. I've heard it from just generally people in the community, acquaintances, people, well, you don't look sick. When I'm talking about going to the doctor for the 5th time in 2 weeks, well, are you okay? You don't look sick. Well, that's really not something you say to people. But yeah, I think that happens to a lot of people in this community because while there are some physical attributes that are associated with Loeys-Dietz and Marfan's and VEDS, not everybody follows that. Not everybody, has those characteristics. So,
yeah. And for medical professionals or medical students listening, what do you want them to take away from this episode about Loeys-Dietz?
Don't base judgment on what a person looks like in the first, minute that you've met them, because it's very, the condition that they have and the things that they're dealing with may not be at all visible. I just had one this week, an intern who was very surprised because I'm a CPAP user. He said, well, seem like somebody who should, and I know where he was going with that because we've all, we know how that is. But I said, well, okay, so that's your lesson. Don't judge by what somebody looks like on the outside. You don't have any clue what's going on inside their bodies.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think it really hammers home too that not everybody with these connective tissue conditions actually has outward signs either. So while it can, I feel like that advice goes everywhere in the medical field, right? Whether it's about getting diagnosed with one of these conditions or about care that you're doing at home, like the CPAP machine for something that is correlated to one of these conditions, it's so important to remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to make sure we talk about people finding out that they have it after their children have passed.
I think that it was one of the things that hit me really hard when I first joined some of the support groups. It was at a time when I was first diagnosed, and I was having a little bit of a pity party for myself. Boo-hoo! I feel bad for me. It happens. And then I started going to a group, and I listened to people tell their stories. Younger people who didn't know that they had Loeys-Dietz, but found out because their child had passed, and in the autopsy it was revealed. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to feel sorry for myself anymore, because obviously that is not the way people should have to find out about this illness. I feel very fortunate. Obviously my son was diagnosed first, but he survived. He's still alive and well, and I feel very, very fortunate for that. There are people that I have met who have lost infants and teenagers and, younger children, and it's heartbreaking to me. There's no need for that. It's a simple genetic test. It's not like it's even complex to find out that you have these things. Right. It's a $250 blood test.
Yeah, I think that's also something that the medical professional should take away. And, if there's anything that we can do as a community to impact legislation requiring evaluation for these in childhood, or I don't know what the answer is to get to a place where people know earlier before tragedies happen, and where they can get treated with beta blockers, or at least monitored for aneurysms, or family members tested. It feels it does feel like a complex issue, but it is also, like you say, it's a simple test.
Yep, it is. I think that it would help if when you're filling out forms, every time you go to a doctor, you got to fill out your whole family history and everybody in your family and the things they suffer from. I think that they could add some categories to those that would help as indicators. Is there a history of people with aneurysms in your family? Have you had an aunt or an uncle who's had a dissection, or some of these other characteristics that could possibly, make people think about whether connective tissue disorder was, the culprit.
Yeah. We have usually on those forms, it's cancers, heart disease, bleeding disorders, but nothing like this. Yeah. Something odd just popped into my mind, and I'm going to ask it. I have no idea what the answer is going to be. Just talking about those things that can go on the form that might clue somebody in. So a lot of people with VEDS sleep with their eyes open. Do you sleep with your eyes open?
Not that I'm aware of, no. Okay.
I just know that there's some significant overlap in outward LDS features and VEDS features, and I've never thought to ask anybody with Loeys-Dietz if they sleep with their eyes open.
That's one that I have not heard.
Yeah. It's so what somebody mentioned to me, Loeys-Dietz feet.
Flat feet, yes.
The flat feet.
Yeah.
So maybe that's our sleeping with the eyes open for VEDS.
Maybe.
The Loeys-Dietz feet. So if somebody's listening who is basically in your shoes 4 years ago, 5 years ago-ish, 4.5 to 5 years ago, and they're struggling with this diagnosis or discovering that they have aneurysms in their body, or, finding out that their child has a diagnosis of Loeys-Dietz, or facing open heart surgery, or any of this, like, what advice would you give them as they're going through this?
The first thing I would say is don't just Google it, because you will get some stuff that it's so old and outdated, and there's a lot of bad information out there. So I would say, go to a reputable source, go to the Marfan organization, go to Mayo, a clinic that has a reputation when you're looking for information. I also would say go to the community of people who have these disorders, because I've just found it to be so amazingly helpful. I mean, obviously, I don't take medical advice, but it's just nice to hear experiences. It's nice to hear that I'm not the only person who's ever had this happen. So I think that is also very, very helpful. And the other thing is to try to take it a little bit at a time, because it's a lot. It can really be overwhelming. And so if you can break it down into smaller pieces and say, okay, this week maybe I'm just going to concentrate on, what I have to do with the cardiologist. And then next week I'll think about, something else, because otherwise, it can be really overwhelming.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And if you're out there and you haven't heard of the Marfan Foundation or the Loeys-Dietz Syndrome Foundation or the VEDS movement, there are links in the episode show notes for this episode and for all the episodes of Staying Connected, so you can go and find those resources. They've got support groups, webinars, ways to meet people in person through walks and things. Like it's a really lively and amazing community, and I hope that you can find support there. I'll leave the links down in the show notes for you. Is there anything else about your story that you want the listeners to take away from this episode?
I think half the battle is just being positive, trying to find the silver lining in each thing. I mean, if I had to say there was a silver lining to having Loeys-Dietz, number one, I've met a really great community of supportive and encouraging people. And number two, it's just made me acutely aware of how fortunate I am to be here, right? Because I survived for 52 years doing everything probably wrong that I wasn't supposed to do, but here I am. And so, I think it's a lot is about attitude and just doing the best with the situation that you have at hand.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think too, I just, saw one more thing on my notes here that I want to make sure that we get in about how rare it is and how rare it isn't.
Loeys-Dietz. So the last statistic I read is that 1 in 15,000 people has Loeys-Dietz, which, if you got a stadium full of people, that's probably only 3 or 4 people, which is pretty small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and sharing your story and for getting so involved. I'm always so happy to hear when people get to meet other people in the community and they go and find those resources. And I love it.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure being here. And you're right. I think that just being a part of the community and seeking out other people is really makes it much easier.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're out there and you need support, you're seeking you're seeking those connections, again, make sure to check out those show notes for ways to get connected with people. Thank you again so much, Tammy.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode featuring Tammy Asplund sharing her experience with Loeys-Dietz syndrome. If you're ready to meet others, get involved, or need support, there are links for you in the episode show notes, as well as information on research studies for people with VEDS, Marfan, and Loeys-Dietz, including those with the VUS. If you like this show, be sure to share it on social media or give it a rating or review. You can also support the production of this podcast by joining my Patreon, making a one-time donation, or by buying merch. As always, my top tier patrons are listed in the episode show notes. In the next episode, we'll talk with Marissa Hart about her story with Marfan syndrome. See you soon.